In this lecture, we'll be looking at the nodes within the shader editor and trying to understand a little bit more about how we can use them to create interesting materials. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And before we make our final edits to the scene and texture the mountain in the background, I want to show you a bit more about materials so you're more able to understand what I'm doing when I add the gradient material to the mountain. So I'm going to change the scene slightly. I'm going to create two windows, one on the right and one on the left. And I'm going to change the one on the right to the shader editor. I'll press N to get rid of that side panel and just double check that you are on object, not on world. So I haven't got anything selected at the moment. I'll use my dinosaur as the example so we can see that material pop up there, and I'll zoom in on that. And I'll zoom in on my dinosaur as our example. And I'll come around to the side here so they're nicely in the middle. Lastly, I'll change this across to rendered view so we can see the changes that are made. So just pause the video here and catch up with me, editing your workspace so you've got two panels side by side. Now we've got our base color here, and I can obviously change that to different colors, but I'll undo that. I can also plug textures into this base color. I'll give you an example. I'll press Shift A, and under texture, I'll add in what's called a noise texture. So I'll bring that to the front here. We've got a factor and a color. I'll plug the factor in first and see what that does to the dinosaur. It adds black and white in random locations and random intensity over our object. I've got some parameters. If I zoom into that, I can change the scale so I can make that noise smaller. The detail does kind of this sort of thing. And the roughness doesn't seem to make too much difference depending on the detail, I think, if I change that. But basically you've got lots of parameters that you can change here. It's difficult sometimes to describe what these do. You just have to kind of play with them, such as the distortion here. You can see for yourself what that does. Okay, so that's if I plug in the factor. If I plug in the color, it gives me some color now. And again, it's fairly random. So color is giving a random color, and therefore the factor is black and white. So for the moment, think of factor as black and white and you'll be fine. Okay, let's try a different one. So Shift A to add, texture, and we'll try the wave texture this time. I'll bring that here, and this has got a few more parameters. I'll plug in the color to start off with, and you can see the waves there. The strange thing about this is it's black and white. And if I change that to the factor, it's exactly the same. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure why they have a color slot for the wave texture, but I'm sure there's some reason for it. Again, we've got some different parameters like the scale. We can create more of these lines, distort the lines like this, detail like this, and so on. Okay, one more, Shift A to add, texture, and this time we'll choose the Musgrave, and I'll bring that up to the top here, and again, plug that in. Now again, this one's a bit different. It's got height there instead of factor, which might be a bit confusing, but for our purposes, it's doing the same thing as the factor. It's black and white information. And again, I've got some parameters like scale, and you can see what the Musgrave texture does there. So pause the video here and add in these three textures and plug each of them in turn and have a bit of a play with the parameters. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, I'll add another texture in. So Shift A to add, texture, and this time I'll use an image texture. Now an image texture, you can choose any image you like. When I first plug it in, it just goes black because there's no texture loaded into here. But you can download any image you like and place it onto your dinosaur. So I'll open up a random image. You can download any you like. I've got a whole folder of textures, so I'll click on that and I'll just choose a random one from here, something like this building here. So I'll click on that and open image. Now you can see Blender has struggled to place it onto my object. Because this is a 2D texture and it's going onto a 3D object, we need to tell Blender where to put the texture. So pause the video here and add in the image texture and load in a random texture of your choosing. So I'll just bring this up slightly. In order to tell Blender where to put the image, we have this vector slot here. And you'll notice each of these textures have a vector slot. And vector means the position of an item. Let's jump back to the Musgrave texture for now. Notice how it doesn't seem to have much problem putting the Musgrave on. It's a little bit squashed this way and a little bit better looking from the side here. So there are slight issues with the way Blender's automatically adding this to our object. But when we go to our buildings image texture and plug that in, we can see that there's much bigger issues here. The reason is that with the texture, it's using a different method of mapping the 2D image to the 3D object, and an alternative method for these what are called procedural textures, ones that are created within Blender. So if I press Shift-A to add and go to textures again, the only non-procedural texture out of all of these is the image texture here. And that uses a mapping method called UV projection, which we'll talk about another time. So to illustrate that, I'll zoom out a touch and choose my Musgrave again and press Shift-A to add. Under input, we've got texture coordinates. Now you can also search up here. So if I type in coordinates, you can see texture coordinates comes up there. And I can bring that in at the front here. And we can now select the different ways of mapping for our different textures. So pause the video and add in a texture coordinate node. So if I just zoom out a touch, so you can just see the Principled BSDF there as well. If I plug the generated into the Musgrave texture, which is plugged into the base color, so I plug that from blue to blue, so into the vector, you can see that it doesn't change at all. I'll do the same, plug the generated into the noise, and you can see the results there. I'll zoom in a touch, and when I unplug it, it's the same. So the generated texture coordinates are what these procedural textures are using. The generated kind of projects the texture on from all different angles, taking into account the shape, and it does a fairly good job when we look at it. However, what happens when I plug the generated into our texture at the top, which is our image texture, which is that building, and then plug that into the base color? It doesn't do such a bad job, but it doesn't look much like a building anymore. It's projecting it all over my dinosaur, what seems to be fairly randomly. So pause the video here and have a go at plugging the texture coordinate into the different textures and see what they look like. Now just briefly, I'll quickly mention that generated and object are very similar, but object is actually slightly better because it takes into account the object's size and scale, whereas generated isn't quite as accurate in this case. So if I choose our Musgrave again, plug that in. Currently it's using the generated and we can see it's squashed slightly at the top there. If I use the object and plug that in, you can see that it's gotten a lot smaller, but it's much more evenly distributed over our object. So if you are using one of these procedural textures, it's usually much better to use the object texture coordinates. The two main outputs that are used from the texture coordinate node will be the object and the UV mapping. As I was saying, image textures will use UV mapping, whereas procedural textures will automatically use the generated, but that's slightly better with object. So I'll plug the UV into our texture up at the top here, which is our building, and again plug that in to the Principled BSDF, and we're seeing what we got at the beginning. So whenever you bring an image texture in, it assumes you want to use UV mapping. We'll talk more about UV mapping later on in the course, but for now I thought I'd introduce that to you so you get a rough idea of what's going on. So I'll zoom out just a touch so you can see my texture coordinates. I want you to pause the video here and plug in the object into one of your procedural textures and notice the slight difference. Also, you might want to plug the UV into the image texture just to see and understand that Blender is using that by default. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so for now I'm going to delete the buildings texture. Notice when I unplug it, it goes back to the base color. And I'll plug in the Musgrave into the base color for now. And I'll just unplug this one so we can clearly see that it's going from the object to the Musgrave into our Principled BSDF like this. And we're not using these textures at all because they're not plugged in. Now earlier, if I zoom into the Musgrave, I was saying we've got some parameters here that we can use to change the texture. We can mix these together, but I'll talk about that again later on. We can also affect the output from the Musgrave to the base color and add an extra node in here. So if I press Shift-A to add, and under converter, so it's converting the black and white information into a color ramp. And notice when I add it in, I can move it about. And when I go over one of these lines, or noodles as they're known, it actually joins it in for us. So I'm now going into what's called a color ramp. So we've got these object texture coordinates that are telling Blender where to put our Musgrave texture. And the Musgrave texture is going into the color ramp, and we can now change these parameters, make more of those grays into blacks or more of those grays into white. So you can see that we've got much more white and black there, and then it's going into the base color. I'll zoom in a bit more on this and I'll bring these back to where they were. I want you to pause the video here and add in a color ramp in between your Musgrave and your principled BSDF nodes. So we've got these sliders and I can actually change the color. So if I click on the black, you can see this black color here. I could change that to something like a red and you can see it change on my dinosaur. And the white over here, I could change that to a blue. And you can see any areas that are kind of grayish will be hitting this area in the middle here, and therefore they'll be a bit more purpley. You can add points in with this plus icon here. So that's added a point right in the middle, and I could change this to maybe a green. So all those sort of gray areas now are much more greeny. Now if I press M over this node, it will mute it. Can you see how it turns light gray? And we can see our original Musgrave texture, and you can see those kind of gray areas there that are becoming that green. And if I press M again, that will unmute it or make it live again, and we can see the end result, which is a beautiful looking dinosaur. Okay, so that's the color ramp input that I wanted to introduce to you. It's very commonly used for converting these procedural textures that you see here into some kind of color. So lastly, your challenge is to add the color ramp in between the procedural texture, so the Musgrave, the noise and the wave, and the principled BSDF. And I want you to try that for the noise texture and the wave texture and play slightly with the parameters of the color ramp, giving those points some different colors. And once you've done that, you may want to save this file, but we will be deleting these nodes in the next lecture. So I'll see you next time. In this lecture, we'll be adding a gradient texture to the mountains, and I'll talk a little bit about how we can modify those again if we don't like the look of the final result. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And I've got my dinosaur selected and the dinosaur material here, which I've labeled red, which obviously isn't red anymore, but I'm going to delete these front nodes here. So select them all and press delete, and we're back to our ready color just here. Now I'm going to zoom out and I want to change the color of the mountains, and I want to give them a gradient texture. So it's darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. Now it may be if you wanted the ground to have a different color, you could select the mountain, go in and separate those faces to make them a new object. It's useful having two objects, one for the ground and one for the mountains, in case you wanted to duplicate the mountains lots of times and things like that. I'll show you how to do that. So if I go into face mode, go into top view and select those faces and just deselect any that I don't need. So there's my mountains. I can then press P to separate. That's how I remember separate. It's also under the mesh menu and there's separate just there, and I can separate by selection. So the selected faces will become a separate object. Now you can see that they are still selected, but we're in edit mode for this separate object here. So if I go back into object mode now, I can select each of these as separate objects. They do still share the same material though, so it might be worth changing this ground here to something different. So I'll come across to the top here and I'll just create a new texture based on the other one and rename this ground and just change the color so it's a ground color like this. It's not in my shot, so I'm not too worried about it. But if you wanted yours to be in shot, then you may want to separate them out. Now I can go back to my mountain texture and start thinking about adding that gradient. So if you do want the ground to be in shot, then you might want to separate out your mountains and ground and give them both a separate texture. So pause the video here if you want to make those changes. Okay, so I'll zoom out of this texture. This is the mountain texture, and I've got the mountains selected over here, and I'll zoom in just a touch on those so we can see them a bit more clearly. Now before working on this material, I'd like to show you an add-on which is really useful. It comes with Blender, and you can enable it by coming up to Edit, Preferences, go to the add-on section here and just type in Node, and there's the Node Wrangler add-on. Make sure that's ticked, and just double check down the bottom here that Auto Save Preferences is on. Now we can just close that and the Node Wrangler is enabled. Now the Node Wrangler gives us lots more options within the shader editor. Those are really useful for two reasons. One, for me showing you the different textures and what they do, and two, it can speed your workflow up a huge amount with some keyboard shortcuts. For example, if I select my principled BSDF and hold down Control and press T, it brings up these three nodes. I'll press G to grab and bring them to the top here. So this is the texture coordinate node we've talked about before, and you can see the image texture node there as well, which we've also talked about. And lastly, a mapping node, so we can kind of change the position of the texture. It's really common to want to bring in image textures and want to move them around your object, so this is a really nice shortcut with Ctrl-T. However, we don't need these two, so I'll delete those, and I've got my texture coordinate node there. Remember, you can press Shift-A, and you can also search for this by typing in something like coordinate, but the texture coordinate is under input, in case you want to remember that, just down there. So pause the video here and catch up with me, making sure you've got the texture coordinate node ready to plug in. Okay, I'll bring that across just a touch and zoom in a touch as well, and maybe just increase this area a bit so we can nice and easily see it. Now the texture coordinates is going to be very important because we want to create a gradient going upwards from dark to light. Therefore, we need to think about the coordinates of the object and take that information and turn it into black and white information. So we need to let Blender know that we want to use something like the object's coordinates for that. The next node we're going to add, if I press Shift-A, is again under Converter, and it's Separate XYZ or XYZ. So I'll click on that and bring it here and go from the object to the vector. Again, these blue are vectors and they're to do with position. So now I've got three outputs, the X, Y, and Z. Now another really useful thing with the Node Wrangler, if I hold down Control, Shift and left click on a node, can you see it hooks it up to this viewer node here? And it shows me exactly what it's going to look like without the influence of any lighting. And it's only showing me my node tree, as it were, up to that point. So the connected nodes to this point. And if I hold Control, Shift and left click again, it will go to the next input and the next one. And the first one was the X, and it's going from black to white along the X axis. The next one with Control, Shift, left click is the Y, which is going from the negative Y to the positive Y this way, and Control, Shift, left click for the Z axis. And that's exactly what we want. We want to go from the bottom here to the top with a gradient. So going from the texture coordinates to the Separate X, Y, Z will give us the gradient we need. Now, if I press Control, Shift, left click on my Principled BSDF, that will bring back this connection to the material output. So I can now hook up my Z to the base color, and it is showing me that gradient there. So pause the video here and bring in your Separate XYZ node and hook it up to the base color from the Z or Z output. Okay, it's looking good, but what if I want to change the colors? Well, we've come across this before. We've got this black and white information like we had on our procedural textures, the noise, the wave, and the Musgrave, and I was able to turn that black and white information into color information using a special node. Just take a quick moment to see if you can remember the name of that node. So it was the color ramp. So Shift-A, and it's under Converter. Remember, you can search up here if you need to, but Converter, and at the top is color ramp. And I'll bring that in over the top of our noodle, and that will hook it up for me. The great thing about this is that, one, I can change the way the gradient sits on my object by increasing the blacks, but I'll bring that all the way down for the moment. But basically this gray value here, if we increase the blacks, we're saying that amount of gray we actually want to be black now. So the more I go up, the more black we get where we originally had that gray. And it's kind of moving the grays upwards, so we've got much less of a gradient here. The other thing, if I bring that right back to the beginning, is we can change the color. So I'll click on the color down the bottom here. I'll make it a little bit lighter and bring it across to the browns. So it's a sort of dirty brown color like this. And I think I want this to be much higher, so I'll start bringing that up. We might want to go to camera view for this. So if I press 0 on my numpad, I can see through the camera. I'll just zoom in a touch, and I might want to bring that up to, let's say, somewhere around here. The whites is a little bit too bright, so I'll just bring that down a touch and maybe bring it across to the yellows slightly, somewhere around there. And maybe I want that to be a fair bit at the top of the mountain, so I can bring that back in. And we've got a fairly good gradient there. So pause the video here and add in a color ramp and change the colors. Now it's a little bit distracting because we've got the influence of the light on this object, so we can see the reflections, so we can't fully see our gradient at the moment. If I press Control Shift left click on the color ramp, that again hooks it up to this viewer node, and it takes away any influence of the lighting and the shading of the object, so we can really clearly see that gradient. And when I move in and start moving it around, you can see the influence much clearer. What we might want to do is add in another point in here, and then I can change the gradient like this, and maybe change the color of that so it's a little bit more saturated, maybe even a bit darker, and bring it down this way. And I think that looks about right to me. And then I can Control Shift left click on the Principled BSDF to bring it back, and making the adjustments that I think are necessary, perhaps offering a little bit more light at the top and a little bit more darkness at the bottom. But I can tinker a bit with this a little bit later on. So pause the video here and have a go at creating that gradient. Okay, so our texture's working nicely. You may find that the mountain has been decimated a bit too much and the polygons or faces are a bit too big. Well, if I go to the modifiers, I've already applied it. That's a problem with destructive modeling. If I want to have more detail in my blocks, so smaller faces, if I go into edit mode, you can clearly see those faces and they're quite big. If I want smaller faces, the easiest way to do that, if I go back to layout mode and into edit mode here, and I'll select all and go into a position where we can easily see it, I can right click and subdivide, which divides every face into 4. I could even right click and subdivide again, and then go into sculpt mode, and I've got my draw brush selected at the moment. I can use that and start drawing some more detail in, or I can use my grab brush and start pulling it around. I might want to go to camera view and kind of see how I want my mountain to look. So something like this, for example. And again, you can still use the decimate option to give it that more blocky feel. So across the modifiers, add modifier and decimate, and bring the ratio down to somewhere like this where it looks a little bit more detailed. You can even sculpt whilst the decimate modifier is on if you don't like the look of the way it's decimated. If you have lots of faces though, this will slow down your machine, so just be a little bit careful of this. I think I wanted a little bit pointy like this, and around there looks quite nice. And I can leave the decimate modifier on if I want to change that later on. So just an illustration there, the problem you might come across if you have applied modifiers and how you can go back and change things if you have. So your challenge then is to add a bit more topology or faces to your mountain and sculpt them into position, and then use the decimate modifier once again to give it that chunky blocky feel. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, I'll be taking you some of the tweaks that I made to make the final dinosaur image. Many of the techniques are things we've already done, so I won't be pausing the video regularly. It's just a chance for you to see how I make changes and the thought processes I go through when making the finishing touches. Of course, you're welcome to follow along, and it's all at a nice slow pace, but you may want to just look at the video and make the changes once you've seen what I've done. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I'm still in the sculpting workspace here. To make my final edits, I'll go back to the shading workspace. I'll bring out the viewport a little bit wider. I might want to make some slight adjustments to the composition. So I'll also bring out a window at the top here. So I've got my camera down at the bottom, and I'll just center that. And then at the top, I'll just go into perspective mode like this, so I can make some edits to my scene if I want to. And of course, I've still got my shader editor over here if I want to make any changes to the materials. Now, firstly, it's a little bit sparse on the trees. So I might go to top view here, select these trees, just deselect the lights, make sure I don't copy those, and Alt D, Shift Z, so I don't move them in the Z axis, and just move them across slightly to somewhere around here. And now we've got lots of trees there, and I think that looks a little bit better. Okay, let's change this across to rendered mode and see how we're looking. On the mountain, it seems we've got this really odd looking triangle up the top here. That should be fairly easy to fix. If I go to sculpt mode, I'll come out to camera view for a moment, and you can see that triangle just at the top there. I can either change the decimate, or I could move this area around with the grab tool. Both of those techniques will change the topology slightly, and therefore we'll get rid of slight triangles like that. So just have to watch out for thin triangles like that, which can change the rendering. If I go back to shading now, yep, we can see that's disappeared, and that looks a bit better. I might just tinker slightly with the mountain textures, give it a bit more lightness at the top there, and I think that's working well. The dinosaur needs to be a bit more prominent in the frame, so I can go to top view, zoom in and just press G to grab, and just move that closer to the camera like this. I think somewhere around there looks quite nice. Again, I'm thinking about the rule of thirds, so my dinosaur's head is still on that top third there, and on the left-hand side here, and the mountain on the right-hand side. I could, of course, also move in slightly with my camera, but if I want to do that, I need to press N on my keyboard, go to view, and make sure that my lock camera to view is back on, and then press N to get rid of the toolbar and maybe just move in a bit to somewhere like there. which I think actually is a little bit better now. Now the randomness of the triangles of the mountain look quite nice and they give it quite an organic feel, whereas the dinosaur has very consistent quads like this, which I feel makes it seem a little bit lifeless. What we could do is select the dinosaur and add modifier and add a decimate modifier to the dinosaur as well, and just slowly bring this down and see what results we get. Already in the face that looks far more interesting with all those triangles. A little bit less so in the body, but let's see what happens if I bring it down further. At that point we start losing too much detail because we've lost it in the eyes. So I need to bring that back up, make sure I get the eyes in there, and I can have eyes like this or really jaggedy triangles around their eyes like this. So I think just there looks quite nice. So this is the before and this is the after. In the before we've got a nice reflection of the light on the eye there, but the after, it's a bit darker in there. It still seems to work quite well, but I could tinker with the light, maybe just rotate it around and see if I can get any of those reflections working a bit better. I could even change the light across to a spotlight so it's directly on our dinosaur here. So there's the cone of my spotlight there, and remember I can reduce that cone so it's much more narrow, pointed right on top of the dinosaur, and of course bring the power up. Let's try 1000 to start off with, and you can see the brightness coming through there. Let's try and get it on the head a little bit more, and that's quite nice because the eye's a lot darker than the rest of the head, so we've got a lot of shadow and it looks quite a lot like an eye now. I might make this even more narrow so it's really focused on the head like that, and I'll just experiment by putting this up to 5000 to see how much I can change it before it looks a bit odd. 5000 is obviously therefore too much, so we'll come down to 2000, and that looks quite nice, but I think the 1000 was probably about right. Maybe in the middle of it, so 1500, that looks quite good I think. Now for this last part I'm going to turn the overlays off, so I've got no distractions, and the gizmos here I'm going to turn those off. That gets rid of my Cartesian coordinates as well, so we're left with what should be very similar to our final render. At this point I may just want to have a quick look at the background again, just some minor adjustments there, a little bit brighter so that the mountain stands out a little bit more. The brighter I make this, however, the brighter my scene. It's worth pointing out at this point that if I go across to the render tab here, I can actually come down to film and turn on transparent background. Now what that does is when it renders, it will make my whole background transparent, and I could put in a color of my choosing in a photo editing program such as Photoshop or GIMP. The background is still having an influence, so if I change this all the way down, you can see that influence there and up, but it does give me a bit more control in the fact that I can put in any color background I want and change the brightness and darkness of the scene independently without affecting what the background will look like. So you have got that option as well. I'm just going to put that back up to 6 and change this back from transparent because we want to be able to create everything within the course and I don't want to overcomplicate things. Another option we have in the render tab, if I go all the way down to the bottom, is color management. So I'll open that up and I'll bring this out slightly. Under View Transform we have an option called Filmic. That's the default, and that gives us a nice lot of color information, and then beneath that we've got the look, and we can change the contrast. So low contrast looks very grey and flat like this, whereas high contrast makes all the colors more vivid, the light spots brighter and the dark spots darker, and it gives it this nice look like this. We can then put the exposure up, and the gamma is a similar sort of thing. I'll undo both those because I don't feel like we need it, but putting the contrast up I think works really nicely. So let's do a render, so F12, and I think that's looking really fantastic. So your challenge then is to make any of those final tweaks you feel will help your image. So I added in more trees, I decimated the dinosaur, and I increased the contrast in the render settings. But how you change and edit your image is entirely up to you. It's also great if you can make this scene your own in some way, perhaps put another mountain in the background. Perhaps if you're feeling really daring, try a second dinosaur just to improve your modeling skills. Try playing with the lighting and the composition and just see how you get on. It would also be great if you shared your work with the community and see how other people are doing and their ideas and get feedback on your own. And hopefully you enjoyed this section of the course. So hopefully you've come up with something you're proud of. Again, don't panic if it's not precisely like mine, as those things come with practice. What's important is the process and the techniques, and trying to embed those in so you can then start to make these items on your own. If you want to try something on your own, then maybe try making a completely different animal. Perhaps find a side image of your favorite online. You could follow along with my low poly animal video on YouTube, links again with this lecture. You could even make a different dinosaur and then add it to your scene. As I've said before, please share your work with the community and tag me so I can see how you're getting on. If you have Instagram or Twitter or other social media, then tag myself and GameDevTV so we can see the results and share in your accomplishments. In the next section, we'll start working on making your models more realistic. So when you're ready, let's move to the next section.